name is Connor Moritz. I am Calendar's Commas. This is the album Ellipsis. I'm a musician. I've been playing guitar for pretty much a decade by this point, and I just graduated from UNO with a Bachelor of Arts in Music Technology and Music Performance in guitar. What originally drew me to this project was a lot of music that I was listening to at the time. Artists like Tim Hecker, Yellow Swans. I was really listening to a lot of soundscape music in addition to the usual rock, punk rock that I listen to most of the time. I found a lot of that soundscape to be really interesting, really transportative music. I kind of wanted to do something like that, but those artists typically use like synthesizers and are masters with programs like Max and Ableton, which I don't have. But I was really interested. I was thinking, what if I just made something like this, but it's just guitar driven? I know artists like Fenez do that, processing guitar through a computer. But I was really curious as to see what I could do with just onboard stuff, mainly my guitar pedals, which were key into creating this project. In terms of the name, I'm not the most articulate or verbose person. I actually look to a lot of lyrics and songwriters that I really like to see what might be a cool name for things or what I think would fit in terms of like the song names specifically. Calendar's Commas, that's actually a lyric from a band called the Weaker Thins, which are a Canadian indie rock band. The specific line is terrorized by the ruling party of calendars and commas, which I thought was a really cool line. So I just kind of took that, made it into my name. As for the album title, Ellipsis, that same song, there's a lyric that talks about watches and ellipses. I like the word ellipses, so the album title, Ellipsis, was a little bit modeled after that too. I did use multiple guitars, namely a Fender Telecaster and a Stratocaster, also a Paul Reed Smith guitar. Some of them are tuned differently, which kind of produces different sounds, different ideas. Mainly the big soundscapey kind of stuff is from my effects that I used. I used a lot, to say the least. Some of the key players, one of them is called the Chase Bliss Mood, which is like this small micro looper where you can record small loops and alter them in really weird ways. Also add effects to those loops, and you can quantize the loops kind of in steps, like fifths and octaves, so it's really interactive. There's also multiple Maris pedals, like the Autobit Junior, which is like an old arcade machine, where it has a low pass filter and a bit crusher and a sample rate reducer, and also a stutter, which can create really cool textures and rhythmic ideas. I also used Empress Zoya, which is essentially a modular environment in a pedal where you can basically connect different audio modules together to create your own effects. You can download ones that people have made. If you have no clue what you're doing, it's really cool. I made one specifically for one song on this, which we'll talk about later. And then I did use a Keeley Echoes, nice tape delay, and a GFI specular reverb, which has a lot of really cool, huge stereo reverb sounds. So my workflow for writing this album originally was going to be, I make certain sounds that I like, and then I write down those exact settings and all the parameters, what the settings are on the pedals, what type of stuff I'm playing, if it's a loop or if it's to be, played live. And I was going to write all of those down so that I wouldn't forget them and I can use them for later. That workflow changed though, because I figured for this type of music, at least for this specific project, I really liked just improvising. I like the kind of an exploration in the unknown, like you're walking into a cave or something and you have no clue what's inside, but you're just keen to explore everything. The first track is called Domino Skyscrapers. It's a very spacey, very elongated, you could say shoegazy kind of track, because it's It's heavily distorted, but it's also very slow and melodic and spacey and wide. It's intended to sound huge. The idea of skyscrapers falling like dominoes, I thought that the sound of the piece, just that image in my head. So a lot of it was actually, it started out with this just really simple loop that I had recorded, and then I was messing with my reverb pedal on this modulated reverb setting where I max out everything just to see what it sounded like, and it completely overloaded my interface so that it was just clipping really hard. But I was like, wow, that sounds really cool. I want to keep that. But the thing is, you can't really turn that down without losing it. So I used compressor plugin to like just absolutely overload the signal. And so that creates a lot of that really buzzy clipping sound that you hear. And then another loop, which is just multiple distortion fuzz pedals that are being altered over time, with filters and bit crushing and sample rate reduction. This is Domino Skyscrapers. Things You Run From. It's the second track, and it's definitely the loudest, most dissonant track. I wanted to make it up towards the beginning of the album because having it at the end or near the end might be alarming on first listen, and having it as the first track might also give an alarming first impression. So I thought second track might be a good place to have something that noisy, that dissonant. So it is kind of similar to the first track. That's another reason why I put those two next to each other. They are similar in a lot of ways because it is really distorted and noisy, loud. Like I said, it's less melodic, much less spacey. It's kind of harder to zone out to. It's a lot of distortion and fuzz sounds. This is one that when I made it, I was just kind of going crazy with tweaking knobs and just making everything as loud and as noisy as possible. It is inspired by some really noisy artists like Sun or Yellow Swans that I really like. There's also a lot of panning going on just to give the piece kind of a swirling effect, almost like you're inside of a tornado. That's kind of where the title comes from, like Things You Run From. Like it sounds like something that you're trying to run away from. This is Things You Run From. For snow absorbed voices, I took kind of a different compositional approach, whereas the previous two were improvising more on the spot, more knob tweaking as the piece went on. This one was more of just finding a certain sound and then recording it and just like leaving it as is, and then just doing that multiple times to different loops so that it would create this structure. So that the workflow that I was going to do, which was writing down and then using that, that's kind of closer to this approach. I got the title because it was originally going to be called something along the lines of avalanches, because it just sounded like a big avalanche to me, or something wintry, I imagine, sort of a blizzard of some sort. It uses really stretched out half speed loops, which are layered multiple times, going into tremolo reverb, which is a reverb that is ducking in and out of volume. And there's other tracks like a 2x speed loop that's creating these really high, clean guitar notes. They sound like sped up tapes. That's kind of gradually, all the tracks at the beginning are pretty much gradually increasing in volume until they reach their height. And then it dips back down into a very slow, even more stretched out tremolo reverb sound, and then carried by a ping pong tape delay lead. That's a little lead guitar part that I played that's also being manipulated time-wise. This is Snow Absorbed Voices. For curtains turn to beating wings, to create this, I use this patch I made that I called it loop keys. And essentially, what it is 8 looper modules that are being manually triggered by the touch of one of the keys. If you see a picture of the Zoya, you can see all the different pads that they have on the front. So I'm using that to both record and play back the loop once. I also set the foot switches to do different things. Like one of them sends all the loopers through a lo-fi cabinet simulator to create this mid-range filter effect. Another one will adjust the speed of the loops to either normal speed, half speed, or double speed. And then one of the switches lets the dry signal pass through, or you can hit it and it cuts off the dry signal so that you're only getting those recorded loop sounds. So essentially what you're hearing in this piece is me randomly hitting all these play once loop keys. Also throughout, I have a loop that's playing, but I have it so that the dry signal is muted, at least in the beginning, so that then I finally turn it on and you can hear more of a consistent loop in the background that's not filtered. So that's the main sound that you're hearing with this track. There are a couple other tracks, like in the previous track, that double speed tape loop thing is gradually getting louder and louder as the piece goes on. It's not heard at all in the beginning, but towards the middle, then you hear it a little bit. I also inserted some noise created with a mood pedal, which has this quantization that's so low, it just creates noise. And then one other track is from the Zoya. The patch is called Basement Show. It's similarly glitchy. It detects a signal and has stereo glitches going on, and you can also add in a little bit of noise to that sound. So that's heard during the halfway point. So there's multiple parts of this piece. It starts out very glitchy, and then it gets overly glitchy, I guess. This is Curtains Turn to Beating Wings. Ocean Caves Are Beds. This is heavily inspired by Tim Hecker's music. I really love the stretched out drone style of his music that you hear, particularly on an album like Harmony and Ultraviolet, where there's a lot of low, darker sounds. Even though they're very low and very dark, you can hear all the layers. You can hear a lot of things going on in just those deep sounds. This one, to me, reminds me of a Snow Absorbed Voices in that it's also similarly carried by these loops that I don't manipulate. It's mainly a half speed loop that's heavily reverberated, and then ping pong delay kind of sound that's a different track. And you can hear a filter. It's kind of like a wave in the ocean that's just going up and down like at different times. That was actually just automation that I did in Logic Pro. So it's this very slow wah effect that you hear. This is definitely the most simple track on the album. I dialed it back just a few loops. That's another thing that I was inspired by Tim Hecker, is that a lot of his music isn't as loud or as in your face. It is, so a lot of it is very, minimal, just relying on one or two specific sounds. This is Ocean Caves Are Beds. So for Be Smart, Stay Safe, Drift Off into Space, I actually made this one before the whole COVID started. I came up with the title a day or two before this was released. Basically, when I was brainstorming all the different titles that I could use, because I didn't come up with titles while making them. It was all at the end. Initially, I actually was not going to use this track because it was just more of a test. Because the main sound that you're hearing is these two pedals that I have, both made by Maris. One of them is called the Enzo, which is a synth pedal. So it's creating that synth sound that you're hearing. And then another one that's going after it, it's called the Hydra, which is basically this multi-voice pitch shifter. What you're mainly hearing is me turning the sustain on the Enzo, the synth pedal, all the way up so that it's creating this constant synthodrone, and then adjusting the pitches of the Hydra so that it's creating these huge sci-fi-esque synth chords. And those are all being fed into a Zoya patch that's called multi-glitches, creating these filtering glitchy sounds. So like I said, I wasn't originally going to use this because I thought it was more of a test and I thought it was a bit too long. But after making the first track, Domino Skyscrapers, I realized how much I really liked distortion and saturation, how that could really carry a piece. So I used this saturation knob plugin while I was kind of messing with the plugins for all these tracks. And I automated that saturation knob to just very, very, very slowly just turn up as the piece went on. And so you'll hear the piece starts out very spacey and low and dark. But then as it goes on, the synth sounds, the pitches get higher and higher and climax. And then the saturation gets like so high that it just gets out of control. I also used a little bit of EQ automation to emphasize this, mainly for a low frequency bandpass that's near the end, just pushing up so that it's creating just this overly loud, distorted synth sound. It's definitely the space track of this album. This is Be Smart, Stay Safe, Drift Off into Space. Devices for Brief Dreams. This was actually one of the first tracks that I made, but listening back, it made most sense as a closer to me. And it's actually in the same key as the last track, so that the Drift Off into Space and this one, they kind of lead into each other. There was something about the way this track sounded, which it has a fast like left and right panning thing that you're hearing, as well as a synth arpeggiation and this huge filtering reverb sound. The way it just all comes together for me, it felt like a conclusion. It just felt like the final like deep breath that the album has to offer. Near the end of this track, this is one of the few moments on this album where I, instead of using a loop, played something live, which was this bass line that you're hearing in the very end. You can hear this sub bass type sound that's just playing under this constant drone. It's a way for your ear to hear like chord changes while this drone's going on, and that made it a bit more emotional to me, I guess. It moved the piece more by improvising those few notes, and it felt like the conclusion that this album needed, not ending on a huge climactic moment, just kind of a nice, spacious, relaxing send off. This is Devices for Brief Dreams. In terms of the future for calendars, commas, I'm thinking just recording more stuff. I think that's the thing I want to do most is just record more albums, more maybe EPs or whatever. I also, like this project specifically, I purposely put the limitation of like guitar and pedals just so it would be from a guitarist perspective. But I think for future projects, I have other gear that I could use. Like I have a sampler. I want to get into sampling stuff. So I think just more exploration of sounds and ideas. I think that's definitely what's next. You just heard the album Ellipsis by Calendars, Commas. My name is Connor Morris, and you can hear this album at Bandcamp, calendarscommas.bandcamp.com. It's Name Your Price. You can listen to it for free. You can donate whatever you want to do. It's also up on all streaming platforms, so you can play it there. Thank you for listening.